Some people seek out strange or paranormal experiences while others are merely going about their daily lives when they find themselves crossing paths with it. For a hunter in Maine, strangeness would cross his path literally during a blizzard in 1978. In 1978, a man in Knox County, Maine was deer hunting during a winter storm. The snow was at least 3 feet and drifting, and his visibility was limited just a few yards. The hunter was utilizing a snowmobile trail, following fresh buck tracks when he happened upon a strange sight. 2 sets of barefoot human-like footprints crossing the trail. One set was probably size 15, the other was smaller, around size 8. The hunter wore a size 13 boot, and the larger track was much wider. Their path came directly out of a swampy bog, crossed the trail, and meandered up through a clear-cut birch forest. While probably not the best course of action, the hunter decided to put aside his deer hunt and follow the tracks into the woods. They went on for miles and miles with no stops, just steady marching. The hunter surmised that he had to be close because it was snowing so hard the tracks would have been covered up. From what he could tell, they never stopped or looked back in his direction. They just kept going and going. They crested a hill that opened up to a power line. He could see the tracks proceeding down the power line, but right next to the woods. The tracks continued for about 500 yards down the hill, crossed the power line, and disappeared into dense forest. That's when the hunter decided to give up the chase. Quote, "What on earth would be out walking, barefooted, in a blizzard in Maine at 15 degrees Fahrenheit? In all, I traveled over 5 miles one way. No human could walk through that stuff with bare feet and not stop. What it was is anybody's guess," unquote. It's interesting what might have happened to this hunter had he been on that path earlier and encountered these creatures. For a dog sledder in St. Paul, Minnesota, his winter night trek through the woods would result in just that. In the winter of 1993, a man named Conrad took his sled dogs to Fort Snelling State Park to run them. He had often taken them to the park for night runs, as generally he was the only one out there and he was left alone. That particular night, Conrad recalled that it was 20 to 25 below zero, and he was trying out a couple of new dogs. They were powerful dogs, and at some point he had gotten lost. To make matters worse, the dogs and the sled got away from him. He ended up walking around a 9-mile route looking for his dogs. He made his way down a trail in the river flats along the Mississippi, a swampy area. Quote, "And so I'm walking along, and I was walking for several hours. I had a headlamp on, and I would turn it on and off periodically to save my battery. I turned the light on, and I looked up in front of me on this trail I was walking on, and I saw something," unquote. Whatever it was, it stopped Conrad in his tracks. He became instantly frightened in its presence. Quote, "I couldn't see the creature itself, but it was tall. I guess it was about 8 feet tall, and the way I noticed was that it turned its head and looked at me. It had yellow eyes, dark yellow eyes. It was dark, and I couldn't see its shape, but I could tell as it walked across the trail. I could see that when it took its steps, like its head was bouncing up and down and it kept watching me as it was walking across the trail. I had to cross that way too, eventually. I was petrified," unquote. Conrad acknowledged that he had been down there numerous times, but he had never seen anything like what he saw that night. In Toland, Massachusetts, a pair of campers would come in contact with the unknown one winter night, arriving uninvited out of the crisp night sky. On February 1st, 1992, a man and his nephew were doing some winter camping in the woods of Toland, Massachusetts. Quote, "I camped on the pipeline because it has a nice view and was accessible with my 2-wheel drive truck. It's far enough off the beaten path to get a sense of really camping. I had to go around a metal gate to get access to the pipeline. It is posted. I found a flat area that had a nice view of the valley, the man wrote in his report to the Mutual UFO Network. The man recalled that it was a pretty cold night, 20 to 30 degrees Fahrenheit. It was a perfect starlit night with no snow. He had set up sleeping bags in the back of his truck, and he and his nephew gathered some wood to make a fire. The pair sat watching the fire for a couple of hours. Sometime between 10 p.m. and 12 p.m., the witness was unsure as he was not carrying a watch. The witness recalls seeing a light in the sky. He gathered that it was about a mile down the pipeline, and it had what appeared to be a bright searchlight on it. He immediately assumed that it was a helicopter and thought that he and his nephew were going to get snagged for trespassing. Given that it was so late, the man decided that there wasn't much point in running. After about 10 minutes, the helicopter began moving in their direction. Quote, I noticed that the helicopter was getting closer, but wasn't making any sound. Where we were was dead silence, no traffic, just the sound of a slight breeze through the branches. I was perplexed, to say the least, unquote. As it drew nearer, the man began to realize that what he was looking at wasn't a helicopter at all. Quote, it wasn't a helicopter, but a black triangular craft with a dull white light on each corner, and a searchlight was centered or slightly to the front and seemed fixed in a fairly narrow beam. Being in the Air Force, I have a pretty decent knowledge of flight characteristics of fixed wing and rotary aircraft. Now I was a little freaked, unquote. The man began to run down a list of things he thought it might be, but nothing fit. When it was about 1/8 of a mile away, the searchlight turned off, and it moved sideways to the left behind the trees. Quote, I was thinking, that is effing insane. I thought that was it. I was wrong. I guess about 2 minutes later, it came right over the trees where we were, and was just hovering there. No sound whatsoever. Nothing. I could see its outline perfectly because of all the stars. It was a slightly elongated triangle about the size of a passenger bus. The dim lights on each corner were still lit, but very dim. The searchlight was off. I could see the branches of the trees swaying slightly, but only the sound of the breeze through the branches. I can't remember any sound at all from the craft, unquote. At this point, the man became concerned for their safety. He remembered that inside the truck he had a gun and was contemplating running and grabbing it. He never got to finish that thought, though, and what happened next would haunt him for years to come. Quote, I can't really explain what happened next other than I had a feeling of complete calm over me. The next thing I remember is waking up in the back of my truck. My nephew was in his bag. I was in mine. I was freezing and had to urinate really bad. I got out of the truck. The fire was out, and I noticed about a half mile down the pipeline the craft with its searchlight back on, slowly following the pipeline on the opposite side of the road, unquote. After finishing up, the man crawled back into his bag and fell asleep. The pair woke up in the morning, and the man recalls that he and his nephew, who was about between 5 and 7 at the time, never spoke much about it. The nephew was convinced, though, that it was a hot air balloon. Quote, to this day, I try to remember what happened in that time, and it's like it's been erased from my memory, unquote. Missing time following a sighting of a UFO is quite common in UFO literature. Granted, few of these cases wind up in the files of the RCMP. On July 21st, 1994, 5 people camping at Tahiti Lake in British Columbia, Canada, located near Quesnel, had a very strange experience. It was a father and son and some friends sharing a cabin. The father and son had decided to hike around the remote lake. Along the way, they spied a, quote, an oval-shaped object about the size of a car, unquote, over the lake. It hovered above the water for 3 minutes, then zipped away. When they returned to their cabin, they told their 3 friends about what they saw. The next morning, the father and son packed up and headed for home. On their way, they stopped at a gas station convenience store on Highway 97. The boy was startled when he saw the front page of the Quesnel newspaper. The date read July 23rd instead of July 22nd, as he expected. He immediately alerted his father to this strange find. Assuming it was a print error, they checked around and discovered that indeed it was July 23rd. Somehow, they had lost 24 hours, an entire day. The same thing happened to the other 3 people at the cabin. They stayed an extra night and left on what they thought was July 22nd. As they drove home, they turned on the car radio and were stunned when the news announcer said that the date was July 24th. The Tahiti Lake Five, as they would become known, reported their strange experience to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and the report ended up in the RCMP's X-Files. In 1960, 13-year-old Michael Halferty left his house to go swimming at Outlet Beach. Then something happened. On the afternoon of July 30th, 1960, 13-year-old Michael Halferty of Picton, Ontario, Canada, was observed walking along Lake Street toward Outlet Beach to go swimming. He did not return home. While his frantic parents posted a cash reward for information about his whereabouts, police, friends, and volunteers painstakingly searched the area where he was last seen. They turned up nothing. There was no sign of him at the beach or in the woods. Then, 5 days later, Michael was discovered sleeping in a nest of grass alongside the Canadian National Railway tracks west of Picton. Talking to investigators, Michael was shocked to discover that 5 days had passed. He was genuinely unaware that any more than a few hours had passed since he set out to go swimming. To him, it was still July 30th. He had absolutely no memory of what had transpired in those missing 5 days. Further, he showed no signs of exposure, sunburn, hunger, or thirst. He was fresh, alert, and not the least bit tired. He was examined by a family physician who declared him well-nourished, well-cared for, and clean. Strangely enough, his clothes were perfectly dry, even though there had been a heavy dew during the night. The only unusual thing was that Michael was wearing his swim trunks, rather than his underwear under his trousers. Since he had set out to go swimming with his trunks in his hand, it appears as though he may have entered the water. Speaking to reporters, Michael's father remarked on how strange the whole affair was. Quote, "It's a mystery, but somebody's taking care of him, that's for sure," unquote. It remains unclear where Michael spent his 5 days and why his clothes were dry. Had he been knocked out? If so, how did he get from the beach to the railroad tracks? Some assume that he may have been walking along the tracks and was hit by a train that caused him to lose his memory. But the pristine condition of his clothes seemed to indicate that no such accident happened. Is it possible that something happened to Michael at the beach? Something that took him away for 5 days and returned him to the woods west of town? For their part, the police seemed satisfied that the whole thing wasn't a type of prank. Whatever happened to Michael Halferty in those 5 days, neither he, they, or anyone else seems to know.